Welcome to the UKADR 2024 conference. We're delighted here at the UCL Department of Risk and Disaster Reduction. We just had our name change last week to be recognised as a full department. We're very, very glad to welcome you all here today and look forward to the next 2 days that we are having together. I'd now to start the main conference with our first session. So we're looking at the conference being the collaborative research to make a difference. When we were talking about the theme for the conference, we really wanted to reflect on where we think we are as UKADR, where we think we are in the subject at the moment of risk and disaster reduction. I don't think anybody in the subject would argue that we shouldn't be collaborating, that we shouldn't be looking at lots of disciplines, we shouldn't be looking at lots of sectors, we shouldn't be learning from each other across boundaries, but we're still not perfect at doing it. We still don't know everything we should be doing, how we should be doing it, and how to always get the optimal outcomes. So we're hoping over the next 2 days we can do some deep dives into where we've had some really successful collaborations, what's gone well, what we didn't do so well, what have we learned, what do we still need to learn, and how can we all together work to really make a difference. So it's not just collaborating for the sake of it, is to make sure we are doing things in the best possible way going forward. So with that theme in mind, our first panel session to open the conference is looking at collaborative research, successful collaborations, past, present, and future. The idea here is that we've got some fantastic panel members who are going to discuss some of their experience, some really incredible experience they have, some amazing stories, just to introduce you there, so we're ready for you. They will each give a short talk going through some of their work they've done and how they've collaborated, what we've learnt. We then may have a short discussion between us. I will ask some questions and then I will be coming to the audience for some questions as well. So if you have some questions as we go along, please keep them in your mind, take a note, and we will be coming out to you to ask questions for the panel members. So with that, I will be handing over first of all to Frank Savage, who will be introducing himself and telling you about his role and all the experience he has with collaboration. So thank you very much, Frank.
Thank you very much, Joanna. My name is Frank Savage. I was a career diplomat for 40 years, and as I came to the end of my career, the office in its wisdom posted me to a tiny Caribbean island where I thought I would see out my working life in some tranquility. They didn't tell me that the island had what they thought was an extinct volcano, which turned out to be alive, kicking, and about to take its toll on the population. After retirement, the Foreign Office asked me to go back and work as an advisor. They said to me, you created a volcanic eruption, you've been through 6 hurricanes in the Caribbean, you know how to start disasters, you must know something about how to stop and prevent them. So I went on a 2-year contract, which eventually lasted 15 years. They were quite slow learners. And I will say a little bit about that program in my talk today. As I finished after those 15 years, I joined Robbie Lyle, who's the founder of Commonwealth Disaster Management Agency, and we now work in the field of providing assistance and background advice to some of the 35 small and exceptionally vulnerable Commonwealth countries, probably some of the most vulnerable communities in the world. So that was my unofficial preamble. Good morning. I'm very grateful to Professor Joanna Faure Walker and the faculty of the UCL Institute for Risk and Disaster Reduction for the invitation and opportunity to address you this morning at your UK Alliance for Disaster Reduction conference. You may be wondering, a bit like me, why a none too youthful grey-haired bloke with no professional qualifications in your fields has been asked to kick off your conference today. My assumption is that in planning for the future, it is necessary to look back at major disasters in the recent past, to look at failures and to examine the successes in order to improve our response contributions in the future. I had my share of failures and occasional successes, hence why I think I stand before you today. I was the governor of Montserrat in 1995 when the island Soufriere volcano, which had been dormant for over 300 years, inconsiderately burst back into life with very little precursor warning, and in the space of 2.5 years, totally destroyed the capital, Plymouth, most of the southern and eastern parts of the island, our port, our airport, the hospital, many schools, and most of the island's infrastructure. In the process, it also destroyed the economy of the island, and it became necessary for me, as the head of state, to make representations to the UK government for an off-island evacuation package for 2/3 of the 12,500 strong community to be evacuated predominantly to the UK. Montserrat is located in the Leeward Islands, is known for upmarket tourism. It's part of an arc of small volcanic islands known as the Ring of Fire. A little over 70 years earlier, Mount Pelée on the neighbouring island of Martinique erupted with little warning, and on the second day, 30,000 citizens in the then capital Saint-Pierre, some 15 miles from the volcano, perished. There was only one survivor. In Montserrat, the Soufriere volcano was located just 4 miles from our capital, where 60% of the population lived and where 80% of the infrastructure was located. The margins were terrifyingly small. An American preeminent scientist, the late Professor Joe Devine of Brown University, took me aside on the second day of the eruption. He said that the scientists would not be able to predict how our volcano would behave, and I simply, as the head of state, would be unable to win. Move the population every time the scientists expressed their concern, and if nothing happened, the community would lose trust in their experts and will be reluctant to evacuate on the second, third, or fourth times. And if the volcano then went to full and devastating eruption, hundreds or thousands of the population would die. The cry wolf factor. On the other hand, ignore the scientists' warnings, and if the volcano erupted quickly with no further precursor activity, even more of the community would perish. Stark choices for which, as a virgin volcano watcher, I was neither trained nor prepared. And similarly, nor was the UK or Montserrat governments. Their public services, the police and small defence force, or any of the community. But with the very substantial assistance from overseas, we became, from necessity, extremely fast learners. And in Montserrat, we set new world standards in areas of hazard mapping, residential zonation planning, and emergency evacuation procedures, as well as launching a very successful program of public education. We were to a large extent fortunate that our volcano turned out to be one of the 10% that go to full eruption slowly, thus giving the large team of international scientists who came to our aid time to monitor the volcano and predict reasonably accurately how it would behave, or in our case, misbehave. Our volcano took just over 2 years to go to its first devastating eruption on the 20th of June 1997, when 19 members of the community tragically died, but all illegally in the exclusion zones, which we had designated as no-go areas a full 12 months before. In the 23 months since the start of the crisis, I'd been forced to evacuate the capital and all the southern and eastern parts of the island to the largely inhospitable northern part of Montserrat on 3 separate occasions, where there was little by way of public infrastructure, farmland, or shelter. And we had been forced, due to the inhospitable conditions in the north, to assist 2/3 of the population to evacuate off island, with the majority coming here to the UK. One of the most important lessons from Montserrat was how we got it, in some ways, perhaps fortuitously, so right. At Mount St. Helens, the Americans, with all their vast resources, lost 57 members of their community in an eruption considerably smaller than in Montserrat. Mount Saint-Pierre, the French suffered 30,000 fatalities from a volcano smaller than our Soufrière Hills volcano, and at 3 times the distance from their capital. And at Armero in Colombia, over 23,000 people perished, several hundred miles from their volcano, which the authorities had been observing for several years, where the cry wolf factor came into play. The answer to this question lies here in this conference room. It was the overseas scientists, aid workers, military personnel, medical professionals, sociologists, and disaster management professionals who came quickly to Montserrat to assist our tiny local team to handle a situation which was well above our local resources and competences. For many of you here today, you may very well have already assisted with overseas disasters, but for the majority of you who are still completing degree courses at UCL, this is the work for which you are preparing yourselves. After Montserrat, I moved on to become the governor of the British Virgin Islands, and in my decade in the Caribbean, I went through and was responsible for the management of 6 destructive hurricanes, all without serious casualties. I've already told you this next bit, the Foreign Office then asked whether I would come back to lead a program, to be the head of a team looking at disaster mitigation program for our 14 UK overseas territories. In the 15 years I was back at the Foreign Office, I assembled a small team of experienced experts. We visited virtually all of the settled territories, reviewed their local procedures, reviewed their legislation, and tested their response arrangements. I also formed a rapid response team which responded to disasters in Cayman after Hurricane Ivan in 2004, where Cayman disappeared from the American radar because the entire island was submerged, and to TCI following Hurricane Ike in 2008. My experience, therefore, is largely limited to small island mini-states, which are amongst the most vulnerable in the world and present a considerably different set of issues from responding to major disasters in larger countries, which invariably have more resources and more trained personnel. In 2008, I started an annual conference in Miami for regional response personnel and agencies to encourage the sharing of best practice and buddying arrangements in order to share resources for all the participating states should their country be stricken by a disaster. The conference still meets each year. In 2003, I presented a paper at an international conference at Wilson Park on the main lessons from the volcanic eruption. This was very soon after the eruption was still going on at that stage. In fact, still is to this day. I reread the lessons I pulled out, reread them again in preparation for this conference, and they remain as valid now as they did back then. The 5 top lessons I identified was there's a critical need for a comprehensive assessment of the hazards facing the territory or country, including hazard mapping to determine the areas of high vulnerability. Earlier hazard maps on Montserrat had little reference to the fact that they had a volcano. The second lesson, contingency plans must always correlate to the likely hazards. It's amazing how many countries have a very comprehensive list of contingency plans, the majority of which are for disasters which will very rarely happen, while ignoring some of the major risks. It's of critical importance that there is a process of public consultation to ensure public buy-in. At the start of the crisis, the contingency plans in Montserrat did not cover volcano activity. The third lesson was for the civil administrators to have regular meetings with technical experts to ensure that the risks are properly evaluated and understood, and that actions taken by the administrators are consistent with the technical or scientific advice. We met with the scientists virtually daily, and on a Monday night I would spend 5 hours listening to their internal debate. I'm sure it won't surprise you that when you put 30 or 40 experts together, they are very unlikely to have a consensus, and there is always vigorous debate on opposing viewpoints. And as the administrator, I thought it was very important to listen to the two sides of the argument and to encourage the sides to come together. And we, quite early on, were fortunate enough to get one of the UK's top seismologists and volcanologists, a very good personal friend of mine, Professor Willie Aspinall, and his immediate superior, Professor Sir Stephen Sparks. And Willie Aspinall used an oil industry technique which had never been used in a scientific volcanology scenario. It was called an elicitation exercise of expert opinion. And in that elicitation exercise, all the participants are required to answer a set of questions and to explain and debate their answers to the questions. And Willie, within 4 days, had got this disparate group of the world's top scientists to come from 2 camps which were advising totally opposing strategies, and got them to come up with a consensus, following which it was then, I won't say relatively easy, but it was easier to manage the crisis. And the scientists had a protocol that if any scientist didn't agree with the consensus, he was not permitted to talk about it outside of their conclave. And if he thought the group was going in the wrong direction, he or she was required to leave the group. Fourthly, we were totally dependent upon reliable communications between the authorities and the public, and between all the organisations involved in the response. In Montserrat, we needed a capability to reach the public 24/7 to warn of escalating volcano activity. And finally, and this isn't always very obvious, donor countries and generous communities around the world will rush to send aid to the stricken community. And we have more 20-foot containers full of winter clothing from the good burghers of Birmingham on an island where the average temperature was 70 degrees all year round. And one of the problems is that these consignments of inappropriate aid block up your tiny port and prevent the essential aid from coming in. The Montserrat story could fill a whole conference, and has, and still only be scratching the surface on many of the major issues which we encountered and largely overcame. Few of the advances and successes would not have been possible without the selfless assistance of some of your former members of faculty and your students and colleagues, including, I fondly recall, your own Professor Emeritus Bill Maguire, who was part of the international team of over 100 international scientists. Thank you for your patience. If time permits, I'd be happy to talk to anybody at length about Montserrat. Thank you very much.